Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Welcome, Brent. I'm really excited to have you on this episode of the Canadian Story for a number of reasons, but also because you and I have shared being on a podcast together, another podcast that we have. This podcasting world seems to cross-pollinate, and I completely love it. Do you want to speak to a little bit of your background, and then we'll get into the meat of our discussion today?
That's a tricky opening, because I'm reminded of the old Mary Tyler Moore show when Ted Knight's character would say it all began at a 5,000 watt radio station in Fresno, California. Always segues into something where people say 5 minutes in, I'm not so sure I should have asked that question. But if I'm going to try to Cole's Notes it for people, you know what? I'm a guy who is living next door to the place where I started life. Fifth generation on the land that I live on in rural southeastern Ontario. My background, generally politics. I staffed for a member of the Ontario Legislature. I rode around on a campaign tour bus with Brian Mulroney in '88. I contested party nominations, and right now I am a sitting councillor in the municipality I live in.
Everyone, he's being incredibly humble. He's also leading a movement that is rapidly growing across the world called CANZUK. Now, Brent is very much a servant leader, and he's not a leader who just wants the title. He's a leader who's willing to put in the work. So he even wrote a book about this. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your book?
Okay, well, right now it's the second edition. It came out in 2018. It's got the really attractive title of The Case for Commonwealth Free Trade: Options for a New Globalization. So this isn't,
you're not going to grab this one off just by the title, but let me tell you, folks, you're going to learn a lot if you read it, and a lot about who we are as a country, but not just who we are as a country, about our history, and not this history that we've been getting that's all negative. We're actually learning about some of the positives in your book of where we come from.
That was something I really wanted to communicate, because CANZUK, and just to tool down, a lot of people listening to this may or may not know what CANZUK is. So let's just get that off the table. It's talking about an enhanced, deepened trade and free movement arrangement between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. Now, obviously, all Commonwealth countries. So when I started writing about this in the early 2000s, and I think it was actually 2003 when I started working on the first iteration of the book, I had seen the four countries as sort of a phase one to a broader Commonwealth deal that would evolve over years. So CANZUK, in many ways, is a very contained idea, a very contained movement, branded, and it's picking up a lot of steam. But for me, it's always been an introductory step to something larger, something bigger that Canada could be involved in.
So in your history of being involved in this movement and your writing of this book and publishing the first and second edition, have you changed? This is when I was reading your book. We've talked a fair bit, but I didn't even know the answer to this. Have you? So you haven't changed your perspective. You don't want to end at CANZUK. You want to go all the way to reestablishing a deeper bond in the Commonwealth.
That is a tricky question. So I have to give a bit of a nuanced answer. It would be yes and no. I think that we have to acknowledge that, like any family, the Commonwealth is a very diverse family, and we're all coming to the table with different things. We're coming with different abilities, different attributes, different abilities, and also different sensitivities. I think that the type of relationship that CANZUK represents could work on a larger scale, but there are certain aspects of what's on offer that wouldn't. And so I would take an approach where there would be certain Commonwealth countries for which the CANZUK approach, the CANZUK remedy, if you will, would not work well. But if you took a jurisdiction like Singapore, it would probably work very well. So I think that, we have to ask ourselves, free movement versus free trade versus defense cooperation. There are so many aspects and so many moving parts to CANZUK. I don't want to suggest that my idea is sort of like a buffet where you just grab whatever suits your fancy, but to a certain extent, there would have to be some level of customization in the relationships. But if you're looking overall, having 53, 54 countries that share so many commonalities and would not only commonalities in terms of their relationship and how they work together, but also maybe a more generalized worldview and also shared concerns about the future. It's always been sort of the Canadian way, the Canadian process to work multilaterally with like-minded nations. So, this isn't really thinking outside the box. It's an innovation insofar as it's a direction that we haven't really pursued, but it's not something that's unorthodox to the way we've pursued foreign policy since the end of the Second World War.
And so seeing as this is the Canadian Story podcast, I want to focus on the Canadian aspect of what we're talking about here. And you and I have had conversations both publicly and privately about what that looks like. I see the vision for CANZUK personally. This is all on me. That I don't think that you've agreed with me in the past, but I see Canada as a real leader on this. I think that we're capable of producing not only a political not a political union, but not only a union of like-minded individuals, but I think we can maybe even help craft the deeper vision of why that's important and what it will represent to the world. Would you agree with that?
I would wholeheartedly. I think that there are a few reasons for that, sort of underlying reasons. Number one, and let's deal with the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the issue of empire.
Yes, I was going to ask you that, so you've already addressed it.
Yeah, and I think I have to actually cut to the chase on that, because to answer your question, I have to actually say that the reason Canada is well placed to take a leadership role is because we were a colony. We weren't the imperial power. And so we're coming at it from a different perspective. This is not Empire 2.0, as some of the critics would point. And you know what, you've read the book, and you know that I've gone into some detail as to why imperial preference and the whole imperial structure didn't work. I mean, it was very, a highly unstable system where you leveraged everything on the power and the might and the economic capabilities of one country.
It was I believe you used the analogy of a hub and spoke. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I always I talk in terms of the physical architecture, and if people can sort of envision in their mind two structures, one would be a simple bicycle wheel. So you have this center hub that attaches to the axle, and then you have all these supporting spokes that radiate out, that give the entire structure its strength, its ability to hold together. Think about Britain as being the hub. So if the hub fails, the entire thing fails. It doesn't matter how strong each of the individual spokes or former colonies were. Everything fed into the hub. So if the hub was compromised, the entire structure was compromised. If you look at the fact that Commonwealth trade, CANZUK, would not be using Britain as an intermediary, that we would be, yes, dealing with Britain, but we would be dealing with each other. It's more like a geodesic dome. And if you're looking at the ultimate where you had Commonwealth Free Trade, you would have 54 nodal points that were all connecting with each other. So if one of the struts gives way, the entire structure is not compromised, not to the extent that Imperial would be. So I always ask people to just think of the fact that it's more of a network model. It's more of a nodal model. So if one node in the network goes down, traffic can reroute. And so there's structural integrity to the whole. And
this is an anti-fragile system.
Absolutely. And I like the little reference to Taleb, because he's somebody that I really respect in some of the workings and some of the readings that he's produced. It's really about building a system that is robust. And you know what, in this day and age, when we're all holed away in our homes, like me in my little rec rooms / office, and we're hidden away from the world and each other, it is important to have institutions and structures that are purpose-built and will withstand all of the stresses and strains that modern existence will throw at it.
Oh, I love that you're using the geodome idea, because I think when we can give people a physical representation to build in their mind of the idea that we're trying to build, it takes away from that, which I think, and I think you would agree, a weak argument that we're just trying to rebuild empire. I, as a Canadian, have zero interest in rebuilding the British Empire. I love being Canadian. I want to remain being Canadian, and I don't want the British people to tell me what to do, and I don't want to tell them what to do. But I feel a deep bond and familiarity with their system, with how they approach governance, with their institutions, and I don't think that I should shy away from saying that as well.
Well, no, and I mean, we have taken the base foundation of their system, and we have adapted it to our sensibilities, and we have adapted it to our needs. I mean, think about it. Yes, we have a British design model of governance, but we're a federal state and they're not. And
which is a very big difference.
Absolutely. And think about this. This is something that I didn't talk about too much. I might have mentioned it in one aspect of the new edition with regard to Rwanda when they joined the Commonwealth, because they're a country that traditionally was not a British imperial possession. They had more ties to France and Belgium. And in the wake of the genocide in Rwanda, the Kagame government made some very dramatic changes. They are part of La Francophonie, but they have made a very concerted effort to get involved in what people know as the Anglosphere. They've become a Commonwealth member. They have started changing their laws to reflect English common law traditions. And to that end, there are legal scholars from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada that have been asked to go over and give expert advice and consult with the government. Now, if this were truly an imperial thing, you just would have had a bunch of civil servants leashed upon them from Whitehall, and you would have had all of these gentlemen who were like the fourth son of a nobleman getting off the plane wearing their pith helmet, telling the locals how to govern themselves. So the fact that experts are coming in from countries that were colonies and offering that, I think it shows that, the world has moved on, even if some of the critics haven't.
And I want to speak to that point, because I think it's an important one, right? Like, it's important for all of our listeners to get over some of the historical stuff. I'm not saying that those things weren't awful. There's a lot of awful things that happened. But I was in Taiwan recently, And one of the great things that Canada is doing in the world is helping with Indigenous reconciliation around the world. Like Canada is we have so far to go. We have so much to learn. We've failed on this file utterly. And I think the test of my generation and probably yours as Canadians is how are we going to, in some way, begin the path towards listening and understanding and consulting and partnership of equals with our First Nations. That is an absolutely essential thing that has to happen in Canada. And if you're listening to this and you disagree with me, or you have something negative to say about First Nations, you could turn this off. I'm not interested in you listening to it anymore, right? But what encourages me about what you're saying is, like, Canada has so much to offer countries around the world, and we have so much to learn from other countries. And we need to get away from this whole let's just talk about how bad Canada was. Okay, you're right. These people are right. Their criticism is correct. But you know what I'm tired of? People who could only be critics. Bring me some solutions. I want to help build something new. And I know there's people like Ellis Ross in BC, a lot of First Nations chief, one of my close friends, Nathan Gita, he was adopted and is a proud First Nation, who don't agree with this idea that they have to be victims forever, right? That we have to sit there and condemn them to this victimization. No, we don't have to. We can transform our relationship into a partnership. There can be healing and reconciliation. I'm talking real healing, not the kind of reconciliation that doesn't lead to any outcomes.
Absolutely. Actually, to your point, a couple of people that I do follow on social media, Chris Sankey and Sierra Bird, who are very proud Indigenous leaders who have very forward-looking visions, not only for their communities in particular, but how it relates to the entire country. And there is strong Indigenous leadership. I mean, by way of disclosure, I think from the early 1700s have some Wampanoag ancestry. So I think there are a lot of people who, and obviously I don't culturally associate as Indigenous, but people would come after you, they'd be like, oh, are you trying to culturally appropriate? No, you're saying one of my ancestors comes from this background. I'm in the same boat. Like, I love what you said earlier, and I actually we're going to go on a little bit of a caveat and just talk about what you love about Canada. But before that, I just wanted to say that I love how you're a fifth generation Canadian, because up to this point on the podcast, the episodes that we've released, a lot of our guests have been immigrants, first generation, right? And I actually come from more of, we'll call it the quote unquote old stock, like yourself, right? Where my family's been here for 400 years. And, but I also, some of my ancestors had, romantic relationships and marriages with First Nations as well. And my girlfriend, the same boat. She's been here for a long time, and her family also has Indigenous members in it. And I think this is something we don't talk about. Like, if you look at me, if we look at you, like, we're pretty white looking guys, right? Like, people, if we were categorizing people based on their skin color, that's how we would be treated. But I think we as Canadians are one of the best countries in the world at getting beyond that. Have we got all the way there? Absolutely.
No. But that's what I want CANZUK to be. And you and I've talked about this. I want it to get beyond this tribalism that has haunted humanity for most of its existence, and be a legitimate source of light into the world, saying, look, you can live in harmony with one another. We do it. We do it here in Canada. And that excites me. But yeah, so first question that I usually ask people, we're just both so excited about this CANZUK thing that we, did the intro that way. But, my podcast, will do it how I want.
You got it.
What do you love about this country? Like, what sets your soul on fire when you think about Canada?
I have to say promise. And I say promise in a very very nuanced way. It's the promise that we make to one another to be civil, to be respectful, but it's also the promise of the future and the opportunity. I'm going to give you a bit of a segue, and just to say that I know that you've had guests on who have come to Canada either directly or their parents emigrated, fleeing some rather defined issues in other parts of the world, and trying to find a different way, a different path, a better path here. That happens here every day. I'm not afraid to say that there is some humble roots in my background. Very specifically, my father grew up in a family that faced a lot of tragedy, and I can tell you that his adult start in life involved hitchhiking to Toronto at age 12 with no money.
Oh, wow. Okay, I want to hear more about this story.
Yeah, he and this goes that his first job was working for a moving company in Toronto, and his first home was sleeping on a couch in the warehouse. It was he saved whatever money they gave for meals and such in order to have enough money to get a room in a boarding house. And funny enough, it was a gentleman. It was a black gentleman who worked for the company who would take my dad home on weekends to have dinner, just to make sure that he had a decently cooked meal. And so, my dad had some very, very different views in terms of people differences, how people interact with each other, because he received kindness from people that were very different from him. So he didn't have a lot of hangups that maybe people of his generation had, because, he had that personal, visceral experience. He was also the kind of guy who would help anybody. And that meant from time to time that he was taken advantage of, but he would still do it because he always identified with the underdog. Now, my mother's family were more established. I have cousins who lay claim to having the oldest family-owned general mercantile business in the country. And I was the first person on my dad's side of the family to graduate university, but I was like number 13 or 14 on my mom's side. So I lived this dichotomy. And I think a lot of people do, and we don't acknowledge it a lot. But for me, I can relate to people who are coming to Canada with very little, because I understand the fact that you have promise, but you don't have the bankroll and you don't have the entree into certain aspects of society. But I also have the grounding of having been here and the stability. And having a foot in both worlds, I think, has been an advantage. It's been confusing at times, but it's been an advantage. But it holds back to your first point, the promise that tomorrow can be better, and the promise we make to one another that tomorrow can be better. And for me, that's key to what Canada is. Canada is a promise and a commitment we make to each other to be civil, to be kind, to be respectful, to be understanding, and to create an environment where we're going to allow people to fulfill themselves as best they can.
Yeah, and a lot of people listening aren't going to believe that a conservative is saying this, but I, as a proud conservative, I'm going to say this. I love a lot of our social safety nets. I think it is a unique thing about Canada that provides, like you said, promise of a better future, because it doesn't let as many people, there are definitely people that are falling through the cracks, but it doesn't let as many people suffer. Can you imagine not being able to pay to have a kid and then owing $30,000 to the hospital? Like, I can't. And,
absolutely.
And
I mean, you know as well as I do, David, that for a number of years, the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States was due to medical bills.
Which is absurd, because you know what? That's not the free market. Everyone says we got to let the free market reign. That's not the free market. If I have a choice between taking out debt or dying, maybe I'll choose. Someone would choose to die because they don't want to like burden their family with debt. But a lot of people are going to choose life, right? They're going to choose whatever. I'll take up, and that is absurd. We should not make the choice bankruptcy or staying alive.
But that hits to the central point about our conception of Canada, having a society where we don't put people in these Manichean zero-sum game decisions, which I find, and we can talk about it in terms of one's situation, their physical situation, whether or not they have enough to keep a roof over their head and keep their family safe and secure. But also extrapolating that to the political discourse. We're so drawn to zero-sum games that we want things black and white. We want things so defined where we draw a red line in the sand and friends on one side, enemies on the other. And
do you mind if I wax philosophic on that point for a moment?
Please do, because I think there's ample fodder for that.
I mean, that's why this podcast has been established, right? Is to say, I don't want to have the mind-numbing partisan conversations anymore. I want to talk about what Canada can be. So I'm having liberals on. I'm a conservative political operative. That's what I do for my job, right? But I think it's enough is enough. We got to get beyond this tribalism, like you said, this zero-sum game where it's all about scarcity mindset and there's only a limited amount of power to go around and we're all fighting over it. Why is that our conception of the world? Why don't we make our conception of the world creating what our ancestors believed in, what every person who's come to this country has believed in? The possibility of a better future. And you know what, if everyone's coming somewhere because they believe there's a possibility for a better future, there's one principle at work there. They believe that something called a win-win-win is possible, right? They believe that everybody can win. And that is not a scarcity mindset. That is a mindset of abundance. And I think that goes back to what you said you love about Canada, which is the idea of promise. Well, promise is only possible with abundance. And that abundant mindset is a lot easier for us to have as Canadians, obviously, because we have so much natural wealth, because we have so much land and beautiful natural parks. We have a bigger concept of abundance. So we're not in that zero-sum game that a lot of Americans are, where for some reason they seem to think that there isn't enough to go around, and that if an immigrant comes to their country, that he's somehow taking away from them. Well, all of the studies they've done on this have proved that that's just not the case, right? And then B, and more importantly, why would you live in the mental state of believing that, right? Abundance is a much better place to live. And I don't know. I don't know that that's a fully developed Canadian idea. I'd like your thoughts on it. But I think that abundance is an incredibly important aspect of what it means to be Canadian.
I mean, I agree with you, and I'm almost frightened to go down this path because it'll seem very partisan, because I do think that certain political points of view point to what would be a ration culture. That and I give the analogy of, you're on a cruise ship, so there's wonderful staterooms and these dining halls and everything's great, and then God forbid something happens, you're on a lifeboat, so you're crammed in. So there's a limitation of space, a limitation of supplies, and one person at the head of the life raft says, we only have so much food to do with, and I'm going to parcel out everybody a little morsel so we don't run out. So there's a gatekeeper for the food, and there's a gatekeeper for the space, and there's a gatekeeper for when people paddle and when people take breaks. And I do think that a lot of our politics is defined by what I would call a ration culture, and that goes to your point. Whether or not we're opening doors to people that were previously closed, whether it be through legislation or even technology, just being able to create new products, new services, new opportunities that way. It fights the ration culture, because the problem is that when you live in a society that is dominated by this ration culture philosophy, then inevitably people see each other as competitors, not as compatriots. And that, I don't see you as a friend and a brother in the struggle to build a better Canada for all of us. I see you as somebody who is grabbing a portion of the spoils that I'm not going to get.
Yeah, so, it's a scarcity mindset. Exactly.
Yeah. So what's going to happen is I'm going to find ways of getting an advantage over you. And that could be that I'm going to gather with a group of people, like-minded people, or people that I have some common attribute with, and we're going to leverage our collective power to grab a little bit more of the pie. Or I'm going to use influence to get the rules changed where I can get a little bit more of the pie than you. And we encourage that sort of thing. And I think it's corrosive to modern society. This is not necessarily a Canadian thing. I think this is something through all Western liberal democracies. I think
this is how I think we can circle right back to CANZUK, because this goes back to the philosophic idea of trade, actually, right? Trade being a positive as opposed to a negative. And this is where I completely disagree with people like Donald Trump and all these nationalists who want to become insular. Is we know from a mathematical perspective that trade increases prosperity, period.
Yes.
And that's because trade actually creates win-win-win. Now, here's the problem. Trade is disruptive. Trade does cause change that populations may not like or may not be properly suited for it. They're not going to be able to recover from it without help. That is the role of government, right? If we have a system that is creating win-win-wins, but some people are being left behind. Overall, the population is seeing benefit, but there are people who are being left behind. Those people need to be helped, whether it's through training, whether it's through investment in tech that may or may not create large numbers of jobs. Government needs to take that risk, because most businesses just won't. And I think that is the legacy of the British Empire, is trade. That's what made it great.
I think so, to a certain extent. I'd like to, though. I think that the legacy of the British Empire is that it's given us the tools to do something better than what the empire was. And let me illustrate a point. Our approach to globalization, in my humble opinion, is wrong. We have pursued quantity over quality. And I did put this stat in the book, so I'm just going to do the rough quote. And you may have seen where I look at trade surpluses and deficits. Now,
I really liked that part.
Now, you'll notice that I gave U.S. data for trade with Canada and China, and it was 2017. And if you looked at the total volume of trade, somewhere around $550 billion each way. We do marginally more trade with the United States than they did with China. Very close, very close.
Yeah.
But we edged it. If you looked at if you looked at the surplus deficit and then did it as sort of a ratio to the whole, so you say the two-way trade relationship is X and the surplus or deficit is Y. So, Y divided by X, what are you getting? You tool it down. And I generated it out as a number, so many cents per US bilateral dollar of trade. So if you have completely balanced trade, and this was on merchandise goods, if you have completely balanced trade, there is no surplus or deficit because, the flows are equal. So perfectly balanced would be 0 cents per dollar of trade. If you're making a profit, then it's showing a positive balance on your side and a negative on the other. Bearing in mind that when you're dealing with bilateral relationships with large countries and many product lines and many service lines and billions upon billions of dollars, the likelihood of getting to perfect zero is very, very unlikely.
Yeah, when you're working with numbers that big, rounding errors are in the hundreds of millions.
Absolutely. But if I look at those numbers for 2017, if I'm taking the approach of somebody who has been traditionally the person pushing globalization, saying, hey, it just increases trade, and GDP goes up, and overall, that's fine. But if I'm looking at the US numbers in 2017, they made a profit on Canadian trade, which was the equivalent of 2 cents on the dollar. Okay, so it's
right
close to zero, but it's
but they're doing well.
It's running in their favor. On almost an identical amount of overall bilateral trade, they were running a loss of 51 cents on the dollar with China. So if you're looking at it, both are about 550 billion. But they're making a 2 cent profit off us, and they're making a 51 cent loss off of China. So, but the problem is that there are certain people, and I always leverage this to a house, for example. If you are a real estate agent, you get paid a commission on the whole value of the house. You get 9% commission on the house. But if you're a carpenter, you only get paid for the work you do in the house. You don't you don't get money on the whole. And the people, so there are people that will justify globalization the way we do it because, hey, the overall amount is X. So if you work on Bay Street or Wall Street, if you are working in some sort of consulting fashion where you get a commission on the value of the entire relationship, that's your pay packet. You think everything's great, and growing it is just that much better. But if you're somebody that only gets paid if the flow is in one direction, then it's not so good. And what's happened is that globalization has decided that the gains for one group outweigh the losses of the other. So on balance, it's good. And to your point about the people who have been the losers of globalization, that we have not done enough for them. But I would say that the way we've approached globalization, we've actually grown their numbers. Not only have we not done a good job with the people who have been the losers of globalization, we've increased their numbers.
And I thank you so much for that. That was one of the most succinct defenses of the frustration that people have with poorly done public policy on free trade. Because free trade with China is not free. It's not free trade. They don't engage in free trade. They put large tariffs on Canadian and American goods. They're constantly manipulating the market. This podcast will never be pro-China. All the Chinese Chinese spies that are listening. I've already been to Taiwan, so don't worry. I'm never showing up in your country so you can arrest me. But seriously, if for free trade to work as a economic concept, we have to actually engage in free trade. No, the Americans opened up free trade with China not because, at least in my perspective, not because they wanted to gain economic benefit, but because they thought they could democratize it. Yeah. And that was the price that they were willing to pay to see democracy come to one of the largest countries in the world. That project has failed. Until the Communist Party of China is no longer in charge of that country, I do not believe that we can engage in good faith in open trade with them. But that's obviously a rather radical view of mine. You don't have to necessarily agree with me, but I think I agree with what you were saying wholeheartedly and loved your analysis. Free trade needs to be free. If we're seeing a balance sheet of minus 51 cents for a relationship, that's not a beneficial relationship.
Well, and going back to your point, I love using analogies, and much to the chagrin of my family, who says, "Oh God, not again." But hopefully they actually make the point. But it's a relationship, and in a relationship there has to be a level of trust. So if you're thinking like a marriage, what's the success? What are the keys to a successful marriage? It's communication, it's shared values, whether or not you want to live in a certain community, whether or not you want to have children, whether or not you want to raise them in one particular faith or not at all. There are a number of factors that go into a successful relationship. I say that when we pursued China, we pursued it because they had 1 billion consumers and a growing GDP, which was really the equivalent of marrying somebody because daddy's rich and they look really hot in swimwear. And the problem is that, like a marriage where you marry someone for looks and money, those relationships don't always work out very well.
Because they have no foundation, right?
Yeah, well, we found out with China, the looks are fading, and there was a prenup, which is preventing us from having.
Yes, I am loving these analogies. I'm sorry your family is so hard on you about them.
I'm not giving away the name, but I had a conversation with a fellow who would be well known to everybody as an author. He's been on that well vaunted New York Times bestseller list in the past.
I know what you're talking about.
I gave a rather stripped down, probably a little more vernacular version of that. And he had just I could see his head shaking, even though it was just in words. And he said, "I have never heard that put that way." Exactly. But he didn't say it was. He didn't say it was
wrong. He didn't say it was wrong.
Yeah, but this hits to another point. I think that there was a conceit that came on the picture. Just as a frame of reference, I graduated with my bachelor's degree on the day Tiananmen Square happened.
Right.
I actually
was born.
I actually left the graduation ceremony, went back to the hotel room to take a rest, and turned on the TV, and I saw the guy standing in front of the tanks on CNN. And just to give a finer point of it, I was rooming with a few people in Ottawa at the time, and one of them was a person taking some computing at Algonquin College, and his wife and daughter were still back in Beijing, and he was due to go back to China the following week. And when I came home, I said, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "I'm not going back. I just want my family out of there." And I'll tell you, his father was a history professor who lost his life during the Cultural Revolution. And he was the only one. And his other siblings had all left China many years ago. They could get out. They all came to Canada. I'm glad to say that eventually he was able to get his wife and daughter out, and but that really hit home to me. And this is going to be the wonderful virtuous segue after a minute, because I'll bring him up again. But the fact is that we won the Cold War. We had this wonderful celebration in the late 80s and early 90s. Trust but verify.
We wrote books called The End of History and The Last Man.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Oh, we were even going to the clubs and listening to Jesus Jones singing about the world waking up from history. But and this was great. Everything was terrific. And I remember growing up at a time when, oh my God, the godless communists are going to invade. They're going to nuke us, and all of these horror stories. So the fact that we won, that was great, and it buoyed us. And the problem is, and this from politics, winning teaches you nothing. And I do believe this.
True. That is my number one philosophy of life. I wish people knew this more. I'm gonna riff on this for a moment because it's winning so important to me.
Winning teaches you nothing, because maybe it was something you did, or maybe it was something the other guy did. Maybe you were lucky. Maybe there were just a confluence of variables that would contribute to your success. But if you lose, oh my God, there are lessons to learn from that.
Failure is the best teacher imaginable, and we're taught to fear failure. I don't know why, but I feel like our culture, it stigmatizes failure, it mocks it, it hates it, and it praises winners. But honestly, give me a lot of failures. I want to fail. Give me a person who can fail 7 times to get back up again. That person's going to be a winner.
Yeah. So think about this, David. We look at the winners and the losers currently, or as the game is being played right now. And the people who are losing, and again, the game isn't over yet, but I find it interesting that in 2020, the people, 2021 and 2020, the people who are on the losing end of these great contests were people that were victorious and triumphant and spiking the ball in the end zone 30 years ago. And the people that lost 30 years ago are on the winning side now. So I almost think that what we did was winning taught us to be arrogant, to believe that what we won was inevitable, and because we were moral and we were good and we were virtuous and we essentially had God on our side, that somehow it was preordained and everything was just going to be sweetness and light. What the other side saw was we lost. How did we lose? Why did we lose? And
they learned.
Yeah, think about it. I mean, Vladimir Putin was a KGB officer in East Germany when everything was going south, and Chairman Xi was a leader in one of the regional governments when things were going south. What they did was, and I wrote something for the Daily Globe online paper quite some time ago, and I akined it to them being almost like the Count of Monte Cristo, the Dumas.
I love that. Actually, in my other podcast, Really True Fiction, we did the Count of Monte Cristo. We as a kind of what we do is we call it finding the existential truths in fiction that can be applied to your real life. And it's called Really True Fiction, but we did the Count of Monte Cristo. Love that novel.
Yeah. So think of people like Putin and Xi going into Chateau d'If in 1989 to 1991 and spending their time figuring out how they're going to get back on top again. And when you think about the title character, once he makes it out into the world and he creates this new visage, his focus is in undermining the people that led to his initial demise. And you almost think that these regimes, they were laid low by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the success of capitalism and free enterprise and free markets. And they've just spent a lot of time just saying, just like a competitor is going to take a product and say, I'm going to buy this gadget, and then I'm going to take it back to the workshop. I'm going to disassemble it, and I'm going to examine the parts, and I'm going to figure out exactly how to rebuild it better, or work it around. And that's what they did. They've spent 20 to 30 years thinking about the weaknesses, and I would say most of the weakness we have is just simply in the arrogance and the hubris we displayed at the end of the Cold War. We just thought
agree.
that nothing could stop us. Yeah, and so we're learning. What we're learning now is humility. And
you know what? I hope we learn that lesson. I hope we learn that lesson.
Yeah, I'm not saying that Russia and China are our enemies. They're diverse populations. They're people that come from various walks of life, but the governance structures are our adversaries.
I will say this. I'm not afraid to say this. Authoritarianism is the enemy. Period. End.
Absolutely. And so I think that our approach really should be, if we had the mindset that we had through the Cold War, where we were open to dialogue. I mean, we would, Nixon went to China, and there was détente, and there were debates and discussions between the Americans and the Soviets, and we did have those exchanges and dialogues, but they were grounded on some very specific preconditions. There were lines that we wouldn't cross. We wouldn't just simply shake hands and pretend that we were lodge buddies and go and have drinks. We understood that we were dealing with people who had a philosophy and a worldview very different to our own, and that they were self-interested just as we were, and that we shouldn't pretend that we can take things at face value. This segues wonderfully back to CANZUK, because with CANZUK, you are dealing with countries where you are as close as humanly possible to partnering with countries where you actually can take them at face value.
And that you share values.
Yes. And this is the thing. We talk about CANZUK, and people talk about, it's an Anglo thing. There's a language. I always make the argument and the distinction that anyone can learn English. You can get your Rosetta Stone DVDs. You can use Google Translate. Anyone can learn English, but learning the value system. I can negotiate with someone in Beijing, and I can say I want a fair deal, and they could say, "Oh yeah, I'm in favor of a fair deal." But their definition of the word fair and my definition of the word fair are quite different. But if I have that same conversation with someone in London or Sydney or Auckland, Wellington, Canberra, Manchester, and I say I want a fair deal, the chances are their interpretation of the word fair is very proximate to mine.
And that's not a judgment on the Chinese definition of the word fair. It's not a judgment at all. That's their cultural way of doing business. They have a thriving society that has a longer history than anywhere we come from, right?
Yes.
But it is saying that it's easier to do business with people who share the definition of things.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. And even if we don't share the same definition of things, and going back to the example where if maybe I'm dealing with someone in Beijing and their interpretation of the word fair is different than mine, then it requires additional steps. It requires some very explicit definitions of the word fair,
so that things are not miscommunicated. Because when you have, the majority of miscommunication comes from different definition.
Well, it's Reagan's trust but verify.
Exactly.
I would say this is trust but enunciate and clarify.
I'm going to have you on again, because I promised my producer that I wouldn't go over an hour on these episodes. So we're closing in on 3 minutes left here, and I have enjoyed this immensely. I love how your mind works. I hope the listeners loved your analogies as much as I did, but I don't really care if they didn't, because I love them. Concluding here, I think we'll have a part 2, but what is it that you think Canada could become?
I think that a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment and domestic policy over the years, whether it be conservative or liberal, always had the dream of Canada as being an indispensable player on the world stage. And I do share that vision. We are wonderfully placed in three spheres. We're in the Anglosphere, we're in the Francosphere, and we are in the Western Hemisphere. We are a nexus point. We're the place on the Venn diagram where it all comes together, and we can leverage that immensely, and we can not only for our own benefit but for the benefit of our partners. And I at a time when people are wondering what Canadian foreign policy is and what our direction is, and needing to find a direction which really states what Canada represents in the 21st century and beyond, I think that's where we need to go. That's it needs to be as much of a foundational statement of intention as we did during the days of Lester B. Pearson and establishing ourselves in terms of the UN and multilateralism. We need that kind of rethink.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think you and I should discuss that. I would love to have you on again, even in a couple of weeks, if you'd love to come on.
I'm enjoying it immensely, and if I haven't worn out my welcome, I'm certainly glad.
Definitely not. And I mean, you and I will be doing other podcasts on this topic. If anyone wants to listen to them, they're through the Daily Globe. It's on CANZUK podcast that Brent and I we are on a panel together on. This is this is a policy idea that I think time has come. And I'm just really glad that you took the time to come on here and talk about it. And I just loved your analysis of what you love about Canada, maybe more just your statements on it. A place of promise. Let's all contemplate that.
Absolutely, David. And I, thank you for this. I there's nothing I enjoy more, even if it bores my family to tears. I enjoy it immensely.
I think this podcast can become a place where a bunch of people who love ideas could just talk to one another and not bore their families to tears anymore.
In other words, you're doing a public service.
Hopefully, yeah. To those poor families who have to listen to their policy nerd friends talk to one another. We can just talk to one another here.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, on that note, again, just so grateful that you came. Loved your analogies, and I'm sure you and I will be talking every day.
Absolutely. I look so forward to it.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's the CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.